Hey everybody, today we are talking about Chamber of Secrets, chapters 8 through 12, and also Hogwarts and the school story tradition in Harry Potter and beyond. So I've said before that these videos are not meant to be authoritative takes on Harry Potter. They're really more just me thinking of a couple of things that I want to focus on that caught my eye in the chapter. And that is definitely informed by what's going on in the real world. I think it's very different reading these books now than it was in 1999. And that's going to be reflected in all of our conversations across the whole semester. So I want to start by going back to chapter 7, which we read for Tuesday, which is the chapter where Draco calls Hermione a mudblood, and then they have to go to Hagrid's hut to deal with Ron's slug vomiting problem. So Ron and Hagrid are trying to explain to Harry and Hermione what mudblood means and why it's this shocking, offensive word for Draco to have used. And the main thing that they're trying to communicate to her is that this is total nonsense. The idea that pureblood witches and wizards would be better than everyone else is nonsense. And Hagrid has got this West Country accent, West Country dialect, and one of the features of that dialect is that he puts the word our in front of the names of family members. And so what he says about Hermione is they haven't invented a spell that our Hermione can't do. Which is this lovely way of using language to signal that Hermione belongs, right after Draco's used this offensive language to say that she doesn't belong. But what caught my attention was actually what Ron says. He says, the rest of us know that it doesn't make any difference at all. And I understand what he's saying, and that his motivation is to support Hermione, but if we read the whole blood purity theme of these books as a metaphor for race and racism, and I think that we're certainly meant to, it sounds a lot like white people saying, oh, I don't see color, or race doesn't matter. And if this parallels real-world racism, then we know that this is a systemic issue. It's never just a handful of angry assholes running around shouting racial slurs. So Draco and the pureblood supremacists who want to do violence to muggles and muggleborns are just the visible tip of this iceberg, and underneath there's going to be layers and layers of systemic barriers and prejudice and microaggressions. So my question is, what does that look like in the wizarding world? Is it muggleborns being passed over for jobs at the Ministry of Magic because they're just not a good fit for our work culture? Is it the Daily Prophet really centering pureblood voices because they don't think that readers will connect with muggleborn writers? Is it people expressing surprise that Hermione or Lily is such a competent witch in spite of being muggleborn? Is it what Hagrid says in the first book to Harry when Harry says, oh, I don't know if I'm really a wizard, and he says, you'll be a thumping good wizard. With a mom and dad like yours, what else would you be? So there's this overarching assumption that muggleborns will want to assimilate into the magical world and leave behind their families and everything that was important to them before. To choose just one small example, Dean probably doesn't get the West Ham soccer scores at Hogwarts. But why should he care about muggle sports when he's got Quidditch now? So this is an area where I think that the text is limited by having the narration stay with Harry. He's muggle-raised, and he has a muggle-born mother, but he's basically treated as pureblood. So unless it's very, very, very obvious, like Draco literally shouting mudblood at Hermione, Harry doesn't really notice. So as a result, we don't see what muggle-born students experience. We don't follow Hermione back to the girls' dormitory at night. We don't really get a sense of what she went through in the first 2 months at Hogwarts when she has no friends. And there's no one in this scene or any other scene that really asks Hermione about her experiences as a muggle-born student at Hogwarts, or in the magical world even more broadly. The fact that our protagonist is a white straight male also means that we're not seeing how blood status prejudice intersects with other forms of oppression and marginalization. Just because we have a metaphor for racism doesn't mean that there's not also going to be real-world racism. So what is it like for Dean as a black, muggle-raised, half-blood wizard? Or, given that blood purity is implicitly about sex and who mates with who, how does that interact with the double standards around sexual purity for teenage girls? None of this is really on Harry's radar, so we just don't see it. But we have to assume it's there, because you don't get a Draco Malfoy or a Voldemort in a complete vacuum. So one thing that occurred to me while I was thinking about how all of this is just how entrenched these things might be at Hogwarts, specifically because it is a magical school. So for example, we talk about institutions being haunted by this or that thing, but Hogwarts has literal ghosts. And Nearly Headless Nick is a nice guy, and he comes off as pretty modern, in part because he speaks 20th century English for no apparent reason. But he's actually 500 years old. So for context, at the time of his death, the Spanish Inquisition over in Spain was just getting started. And who knows what's going on with the Bloody Baron, when he's from, where he's from, why he's so covered in blood. But between the ghosts and the portraits on the walls at Hogwarts, all of which can talk, these young students are surrounded by influences that presumably share at least some of the social attitudes of their day, hundreds of years ago. So take a second and think about some of those social attitudes, and what it would be like to be 12 years old and hearing these attitudes casually expressed and reinforced as you go about your day at school. Then there's Dumbledore himself, over 110 years old, who is similarly guided by the council of former headmasters and headmistresses whose portraits are in his office. Imagine trying to steer Hogwarts away from the prejudices of the past under those circumstances. And then there's the Sorting Hat. I have so many questions about the Sorting Hat, but let's just focus on one question for now. And that question is, who bewitched the Sorting Hat? Does each new headmaster or headmistress bewitch the hat? Or is it, if they did that, I could imagine it sort of being reprogrammed to the context of that time period? Or is it the same spell from 1,000 years ago spoken by, we don't know? The hat speaks in contemporary English, so is that evidence for multiple renewed bewitchings? Or is it evidence that the hat updates itself with the times without having any intervention from one of the headmasters or headmistresses? On Pottermore, the Sorting Hat is a proprietary algorithm, which incidentally maps pretty well onto known psychology tests, like personality tests in psychology. There's an interesting study on that. I'll put it in the recommended reading folder on Blackboard. But anyway, so it's an algorithm on Pottermore, which is part of what makes me think about the Sorting Hat in the books as being kind of programmed. Because we know in the real world that algorithms aren't neutral. It matters who codes them, and it matters which data is used to train them, which is why we can have algorithms that produce racist or sexist results. So I'm interested in who bewitches the Sorting Hat, and also in what definitions it uses and understands. Even to take a fairly non-controversial house like Gryffindor, the meaning of bravery has changed over thousands of years. Neville's earning house points for standing up to his friends, not for going on some sort of chivalric quest for the Holy Grail. So how does the Sorting Hat incorporate the changes to our values, and how might it extend the lifespan of outdated values, even accidentally? Which brings me inevitably to Slytherin, both the house and the man. And I want to acknowledge, first of all, that many of you identify as Slytherins, and I'm not really talking about you. I'm talking about Slytherin House that exists fictionally in the pages of these books. Secondly, some Black and queer Harry Potter readers have written about Salazar Slytherin being motivated by a separatist vision rather than a supremacist vision in an age in which Muggles were persecuting magical people. And that makes a lot of sense to me, and I think we can definitely see the influence of separatist thinking in a lot of the laws of the wizarding world, essentially to keep both magical people and Muggles safe by keeping witches and wizards to themselves and Muggles ignorant of the magical world. But in Book 2, we have to contend with the fact that whatever Salazar Slytherin may have intended 1,000 years ago, it's gotten to the point that ideas of pureblood supremacy are thriving, and most of Hogwarts believes that Slytherin built a secret chamber with some kind of monster in it that kills Muggle blood students, which is a pretty insane thing for students to casually believe about one of their school's founders. To be fair, a lot of what we see of Slytherin we have to take with a grain of salt, because Harry is so obviously anti-Slytherin. So I was a little bit surprised in the Polyjuice potion scene when Harry and Ron accompany Draco into the Slytherin common room, and the password to get in is pureblood. And again, I wonder who chooses the passwords. Is it Snape? Is it a prefect? Is it the Bloody Baron? Because at best, that's in really poor taste, especially given what's going on right now. At worst, it's completely on message and suggests that Harry may not be very far off in his impression of Slytherin. So I think about students in the real world attending schools named after Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis, and the effects that has on both students of color and white students. To me, this looks pretty similar. For Slytherin students, even if the criteria for sorting into Slytherin House really has shifted to just ambition, they're surrounded by toxic influences that promote a pureblood agenda, even down to little things like the password they say to get into their shared space. And for Muggle-born students, they may not be in Slytherin House, but it's this daily reminder of the history that's very much still present at Hogwarts, and the forces in the magical world that are powerful and numerous enough that it would be unlikely for Hogwarts ever to do away with Slytherin House. So that's all that I have for you for right now. I am looking forward to hearing more about what you've been thinking about these chapters in class in a little bit. See you then.